Hear you, sir.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm Nicholas Arndt. I'm Nick in this images. I'm a geochemist, petrologist, in other words, a geologist at the University of Grenoble. I'm also involved with a small company called SysProbe, and there we use the passive seismic technology to look for ore deposits, and involved with an H2020 program called Pacific, where we do the same thing. Now, Sarah, I've changed the title of my talk because COVID has been talked about a lot in past days. I'm going to talk about a related topic, which is public perception of mining in Europe. So I'm going to start with this statement that I saw in an article from the BBC on urban mining. The extractive industries are responsible for over 90% of biodiversity loss, according to UN's own Global Resources Outlook. I said, is that possible? 90% due to extraction industries? So here, you can maybe see my mouse. This is the report. It's an excellent report by the International Resource Panel. And indeed, on page 5, we find this statement: 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress are caused by resource and extraction and processing. And next to it, we see a picture of an open pit. So the message seems clear. Mining causes tremendous damage to biodiversity. But when you look in the report in a little bit more detail, we find it's not so straightforward, because here on the right, we see that we find metals, non-metallic minerals, fossil fuels, what we'd normally call extraction industries. But there's also this item called biomass. And it turns out that biomass includes agriculture, grazing, crops, biofuels, also forestry, even fishing. So when we look at this diagram, that helps us explain this diagram here. 80% of loss of biodiversity is due mainly to agriculture and other activities. So BBC picked this up, misreported it, and I think contributed to the relatively negative image that the that mining has. Now, I'm going to relate this to the next slide, where we see, as we've seen before, that Europe imports most of its metals. Is Europe, like US, a major consumer and importer of metals? And here's Europe production, a little bit from Ireland, some from Eastern Europe, and the central part of Europe is here. For decades, through the last part of the last century, nobody really cared much about this. The politicians said metals arrive in boats at the major ports. We don't need to worry about it. They worried about agriculture, 60 billion euros a year for the common agricultural policy and nothing for the minerals industry. Until about 2011, with the rare earth element crisis, when China restricted exports of rare earths. And this spawned a number of national and Europe level programs, which we see here, whose goal it is to secure a supply of raw materials for European industry. These programs have a lot of justification because mining can be done responsibly and efficiently in Europe. I'd like to refer to the Aitik mine, Boliden's Aitik mine in northern Sweden, a harsh climate, a mine that respects relatively stringent social and environmental conditions, but mines copper with an average grade of 0.27%. And this, people in the business will know, is about half the average grade throughout the world. Mining can be done properly in Europe. Another example is the Lachine mine, lead zinc in Ireland, a relatively compact underground operation. When it was operating, now it is closed, and here to the right, we see the successful restoration, which was done at the site. So we have good examples like this. We can say, well, there should be mining in Europe, but not everybody agrees. And here I use the term interested parties, advisedly following the discussion yesterday. Not all groups support mining in Europe. The image was taken a couple of years ago in western part of France, where a small company proposed to do some exploration. They did it properly. They talked to the local communities. They explained what they were going to do. But then 3 weeks later, there were well-established groups in all the villages who opposed the idea. They had some justification because there had been previous mining in the area, and that wasn't done properly. But their point of view was rather radical, as seen in their slogan, "No to mines, not in Rues, which is the area where we are, not anywhere." They thought there are credible alternatives to mining. We simply don't need to do this. I'm going to go on further and talk a little bit about this comparison between agriculture and mining. You know about the local movement, the idea that we should consume local products. I like the idea. We should do that. Support local industry, support local farmers, get fresh produce and so on. We should avoid food miles, the idea that we import green beans from Kenya. But why do we never talk about metal miles? Because what we consume in Europe comes from far away. Ores are heavy, metals are heavy. There's clearly a penalty for this. Why don't we talk about this? Mainly because most of us in this crowded part of the globe don't really like the idea of mines in our backyard. So now leading to coronavirus. I thought about this. I'm not going to talk about the rumor that a Mexican beer has rebranded. I'm not going to talk about the economic crisis because that's been well covered, as has the climate challenges. But what I'm going to talk about is the reaction against globalism, calls for protectionism that seems to be associated with the current crisis. Here are some quotes. Here in France, people got very worried because we don't produce many masks or pharmaceutical items here in France currently. It comes from China. Here's a quote from a policy paper of the Schuman Foundation when they said the pandemic has revealed Europe's vulnerabilities. We are too dependent on the outside world. Another one from Science Business Newsletter from 2 days ago. Governments are anxious because, let me just get there, because there are, well, I'm just going to do something here because I can't read it, are anxious to make their economies more resilient, are looking to bring back offshore manufacturing. But these ideas, from what I've been able to see, never extend to the minerals industry. I'm just have to do this. There we go. So my question is, why are mineral resources ignored in these discussions? And an associated question, why does mining have such bad press? We know why it is, because mining was done badly in the past and is still being done badly in a lot of places throughout the globe. But another factor is the sites where a lot of people, a large part of the population, the policymakers also to some extent, get their information. They get it from sites like this one here, a French site called Stop Mines 23. And this is the site which provided a lot of information for the groups that demonstrated against mining in Rues. The site is quite good because it provides information, background information, but it's also a bit of a mismatch with rants from anti-vaxxers and other people like that. Here's another site, Earthworks, and they write to me directly. Dear Nicholas, Chelsea Dow is making bracelets from cloths materials because she says that bracelets are made from precious metals that come from harmful mining. And I asked the question, can we try to counter the misinformation on these sites? Can we open up lines of communications with these groups? So I thought, can we use the social media? Can we perhaps get an influencer, somebody who can sway the target audience to help us do this? So I Googled science influencer and I came up with this group here, 10 people, old, male, affluent, I'm older than them, but probably less affluent. Or there's another term I found in this chat yesterday, well-paid spin doctors and consultants. That's probably not what we want. Maybe we want somebody else like these people here. Dinah Cowan, physics girl who had too much pie for Thanksgiving. She has a very nice site. Brian Cox with over 3 million followers. Influential. But they talk about space, about exploration, about biological processes. They're not geologists. We probably need an earth scientist. Off to the right, we have Mika McKinnon, Canadian, a geophysicist. But Sarah, you'll be very pleased to see that she has a rock in her hand and a hand lens as well. Ian Stewart, a geologist. Now, I know him, and I got in touch with him saying, what do you think? Would you be interested in having a program on this issue, mineral products, mineral supply for Europe, and the issues that are involved? And he has said yes. So maybe that's worth following up. And getting back to my first slide, this statement here. When I read it, I got in touch with some people I know, Richard Harrington, John Thompson, and others, and I said, can we do something about this? So we got in touch with BBC journalists. I won't give their names, but they're people we know or know of. We said, would this be interesting for you to do a program on this subject? And so far, the response is positive. Now, Sarah and Rose, you've produced a remarkable body of information here that I think that we've told the BBC producers they could use, and we are hoping to follow this up. So thanks, that's my talk. I'm waiting for questions, happy to answer them. And I'm waiting to hear from Sarah whether thunderous applause is now echoing around the internet.
Thank you very, very much, Nicholas. And yes, you guessed it. There is amazing applause rolling around the world right now in thanks for your fantastic presentation. So brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Nick. So to this, I mean, I think you bring to the fore some really, really pertinent points. And the fact of, you know, we talk about eat local, avoid those food miles. Where are these metal miles? I have to say, I loved your rebranding of a certain Mexican beer. So thank you very much for bringing some humor to this afternoon session. That's brilliant. From your perspective, I mean, you know, other than, say, for example, getting the BBC, for example, to be engaged, are there any other avenues that we as a community should be leveraging or pushing on at the moment? Because I imagine that it is a multi-pronged approach that needs to be looked at here.
You know, I think there are two target audiences. We have to think who, if we can approach BBC and get them to do something, who would we like them to talk to? I would like to think this would open up lines of communication with the people who have the website in France, or the other one, the Portuguese one, which we heard about in the chat yesterday. That would be good. But I'd also like to see if we could get in touch more with the policymakers, the people in Brussels or London or Washington who make the decisions. And that's tougher. Now, there we have to find a way to communicate with them, to get the message across to them. And I think to do that, we can use your site, the webinars, this information. We also have to use other types of media and means of communication.
Brilliant. Yes, so I think that builds really nicely actually on some of the discussion that we had this morning about, yes, we've got to make sure that those policymakers, etc., truly understand what's going on here as a whole. So two quick comments before we go on to our next speaker here. So firstly, a massive thank you to the wonderful Richard Harrington for pointing out that today is indeed St. Corona's Day. So there we go, that's perhaps fairly apt. So that goes nicely with your rebranded beer there, Nicholas. But the second comment here is perhaps a question that comes in from Sandra. And Sandra's asking, she's saying, isn't the European perceptions about mining linked with a lack of trust with regards to justice? Are people afraid that in the case of a disaster provoked by bad management, the people responsible for the disaster will go free?
Very true. You know, that we've heard a lot about trust and the need to have trust if people, populations, local communities are going to accept mining operations nearby in their backgrounds. And again, I'm going to make a push for Europe. Basically, things in Europe run relatively well in most cases. Mining operations now, from what I know, are relatively well handled. And this brings back to the original question, the case I'm trying to make, that at least some mining should be done in Europe rather than other areas where there'd be much poorer control on what goes on, partly because of policy limitations, partly because of the justified lack of trust of populations in the government, the governors, the people who govern them. So this is an immediate thought, another plea for a little bit more mining in Europe.
Brilliant. So with that, Nicholas, thank you so much for slotting into this tight time slot at the beginning of this afternoon session. Another massive round of applause is coming at you now from behind those microphones. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen,